Hiya. Um, I would say if you're new here, but I'm the one who's new. I'm Betty. I am a big fan of books, movies. I've recently gotten into video games. Um, I'm a big fan of stories, and I kind of can't be normal about it. Um, I have to like process everything through like writing shit out and talking about it. I've got a Substack. I have an Instagram. I'm not very good at. Um, but I always like yap too much for like reels and stuff. So I thought maybe this might be a cool option to put things out there and talk about things that I like without feeling like I need to condense everything into like 90 seconds. So I kind of considered putting everything in one video because on my Substack once a week I put together like a little digest of kind of like everything that I read and watched and played and stuff and what I've like thought about it. And so I kind of thought about doing the same thing for like to wrap up the month in this video and talk about like everything. But I think that might be like taking the piss. I think it might be a little bit like too long. Not because I like read a ton and watch a ton, especially this month. I've only watched two new movies this month. Um, but because I've like recently gotten into video games, I have been playing tons of like demos to try and like figure out what I like and stuff. Um, and I've played so many that I feel like just talking about them is like gonna take up like ages. So I thought I'll do that in its own video and I'll just talk about books here. So if that's something that you would be interested in, keep an eye out for that. Um, Otherwise, yeah, I'm just gonna talk about books today. So the first thing that I read this month was Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. I've read this before. I read a physical copy when I first read it, but this time around I did it on audiobook, um, and I loved it just as much this time as I did the first time. I'm a big fan in this book in particular of the way that Emezi is able to explore really big ideas and really complicated, heavy themes through a very approachable young adult narrative. So this is about a young kid called Jam who lives in a it's kind of like an Afrofuturist, post-revolution, post-liberation kind of society called Lucille. Um, that is kind of community led. There's no prisons anymore. There's no billionaires. So basically, all the kind of corruption, racism, poverty that we currently live with is eradicated. Um, and it's kind of referenced a little bit in this book that there was a revolution that took place where um, these like angels came and got rid of all the monsters, and now the society kind of lives peacefully. So Jam is a young trans kid who's born into this society, um, having been like taught that like all the monsters are gone. Lucille is now kind of like peaceful, harmonious. There's nothing to be frightened of or worried about anymore. And Jam becomes kind of like really interested in the idea of these like angels, and she starts looking into them, um, like reading books about them, that sort of thing, along with her best friend Redemption. Jam's mother Bitter is a painter, and she paints this like crazy portrait of an angel, right? And one night Jam goes in to look at it, cuts herself accidentally, and bleeds on this painting. And lo and behold, this creature comes alive and comes out of the painting. When this creature, who Jam calls Pet, comes out of the painting, they tell Jam that they have been summoned because there is a monster in Lucille that needs to be hunted. Um, and Jam is very much like, that's not possible. There are no monsters. When her parents, Bitter and Aloe, find out, they're also like, there's no monsters here. It must be a mistake. Pet needs to go away. But Pet insists that something has gone wrong. Now, I think Jam really wants to believe this as well. But then Pet tells Jam that there's an evil lurking in Redemption's house. And the main thing for Jam is that Redemption is safe. So she joins Pet on this hunt, and they uncover that not everything is peachy. I don't want to spoil what happens in this, but if you have any particular triggers, I would recommend just double checking the content warnings just in case. Nothing happens like on page, but the themes are quite heavy, because ultimately what this book is kind of dealing with, or sort of thinking through maybe, is that you can kind of get rid of these big societal problems and these kind of institutional monsters, but bad things are still going to happen. And when you've gotten rid of a retributive justice system, how do you deal with bad things happening whilst not compromising your principles and morals as a society? Which is a kind of like quite a complicated, quite a big thing for a young adult novel to be dealing with. And I think that Emezi brings together this kind of like almost existential philosophical question with a very engaging young adult novel. And I think it's masterful. Um, I also think like it's really beautiful in the way that, like, it sounds really heavy, obviously, but the way that it depicts this kind of like post-liberation future in which people live together harmoniously, regardless of like skin color, regardless of disability, regardless of sexuality, relationship dynamics, all that sort of thing. It's very like, it's almost this like wondrous what could be if we prioritized caring about each other first and foremost. It's stunning. Love. Then I read, well, I read a few things, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to jump ahead to the last book that I actually read this month, which was Bitter, which is the prequel to Pet. I finished this actually like just this morning, so I'm kind of cheating. So this is kind of this is about Jam's mother, Bitter, during the revolution. So the revolution is kind of referenced in Pet, but we only really know that like the angels came and got rid of the monsters. This is very much about what exactly happened then. So this obviously follows Bitter when she's a young woman. She's a former foster child and has finally found a kind of place to belong at Eucalyptus, a fancy art school in the heart of Lucille. But Lucille at this point in time is kind of completely embroiled in civil unrest. It is sort of protests in the street all the time. There's a kind of corrupt billionaire who's sort of running the town, owns all the kind of housing, is making people sick by kind of not caring about the housing properly, all that sort of thing. So Bitter is kind of on the outside of the kind of protests and stuff happening outside the art school. She doesn't really want to be on the front lines. She gets really anxious. She's had a really, really hard upbringing. She's kind of scared of the violence that's happening outside. There is a revolutionary group in this called Asada, named after Asada Shakur. And she has friends that are part of it, but she doesn't really want to be engaged with it. But Bitter kind of has this secret. Ever since childhood, she has been able to bring her drawings to life so long as she bleeds on them. And one day, after a particularly violent protest in which one of her friends is brutally assaulted, in rage, she paints this creature and brings it to life. In the same way as Pet, what she's really done is brought through a kind of avenging angel called Vengeance, who recognizes her anger and says that they've come to rid Lucille of the monsters. But despite Bitter's rage, she doesn't really want people to be harmed, and Vengeance wants to kill people. So then this book kind of becomes about what price are we willing to pay for revolution? Should a revolution be violent? Should it not be violent? If it's going to be violent, are there boundaries around what level of violence we're willing to participate in? And these questions are kind of played out between different characters who want different things, who feel different things. And ultimately, we end up seeing kind of what happens to lead to the events of Pet. In the same way as Pet, I remain kind of in awe of Emezi's ability to blend complex ideas, in this case, kind of like questions about revolutionary politics, with a young adult narrative. It's crazy that they're able to blend them so seamlessly. I don't think this is as narratively strong as Pet, but it's still great. And it still has a lot to say, and it still, I think, leaves you with a lot to think about, all in a kind of 250-page young adult novel. This one does skew a bit older than Pet, despite, I think, the themes on the whole being a little bit less intense. But Bitter is older than Jam is. And so I think the way that characters relate to each other and the things that they're thinking about and talking about are a little bit older, in this one than in Pet. But I would still say this functions as a kind of like young adult novel. Um, but not like any young adult novel you've probably read before. It's genius, and I think together these are excellent series. So moving on, I have this thing where I really like to read through lists, um, but I have this kind of like slightly unhinged take where I will just collect lists and read through them in the slowest way imaginable, that the list is like no longer really relevant. Um, and I do this particularly with all of the like major prize lists. So like the Booker Prize, the International Booker Prize, and the Women's Prize, Stella Prize here in Australia. So I have like a backlog of long lists for these prizes that go back, I think, to 2022 is the earliest unread list I have at the moment. Um, but I keep collecting them, and I'll read through them eventually. Um, but I am well behind. But the list that I'm working on at the moment is the Women's Prize for Fiction, last year. I know that the shortlist for the 2026 prize has recently been announced, but you will probably not catch me reading that for several years. But at the moment, yes, I'm working on the long list for last year's prize. And this month I read The Persians by Sanam Malouji. This is kind of a family saga that follows 5 Iranian women across like 3 generations of the one family. So you have Elizabeth, who is the kind of the matriarch, the grandmother. She lived through the coup in Iran in 1953, and then the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and we kind of track her experiences across the decades. We've also got her daughters, Shirin and Shima, who both fled Iran in 1979 as the revolution was unfolding and moved to the US. And we kind of see bits of their life in the US as sort of Persian immigrants. Then we have Shima's daughter Bitter, who grows up in the US, and Shirin's daughter Niaz, who grows up in Iran. She stays behind in Iran. So the perspective switches every chapter between each of the women, and the timeline kind of moves around all over the place, from their like childhoods, adulthood, kind of all over the place. If there's a through line to the novel, it's that at the beginning, Shirin and Bita are on holiday in Aspen, and a cop kind of starts flirting with Shirin and like makes some like racially aggressive kind of comments, and then she pushes back at him, and like plays into this like fantasy of his to try and like make fun of him, but then she gets arrested. She pisses him off. He doesn't really like a woman standing up to him, I think, and she gets arrested. She gets accused of attempting prostitution. And then the rest of the book is kind of like leading up to her hearing. But it goes between all the different women, and um, but it's kind of like building to that event, and the women are kind of like reflecting on their lives as it goes on. Again, kind of like Amezi's work in Pet and Bitter, Malouji here is kind of really blending the personal and political. Um, each of these women, their lives and their experiences are very much shaped by politics and revolution. For instance, Maligie explores Elizabeth's life under different governments. She contrasts Bitter's life in the US as a kind of like a first generation immigrant with Niaz's life in Iran living under um, a kind of post revolution society. But she's also exploring like questions of like identity, like how do Shima and Shirin both reconcile their kind of like Iranian identity with being American women? What kind of aspects of culture do they hold on to in America and try to get rid of? There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the novel. I think one of the things that I liked a lot was the way that she explored motherhood. Um, Elizabeth is not a kind of naturally maternal woman. Um, and it really, you can see kind of how it trickles down through Shima and Shirin into Bitter and Niaz, the way that Elizabeth was really kind of a closed off, emotionally unavailable mother to her daughters. But Maligie's never really judging her for that. It's more observational, and it's more also related to the way that Elizabeth is raised and the way that she lives. I found it to be a really beautiful book, particularly because I was just enamored with the way that these women were written. They are often really unlikable. They make, like Shirin in particular, is often making decisions wildly on instinct. Um, but she's wholeheartedly herself. All these women felt really complicated and really nuanced and like real women, which was so kind of like refreshing to read. Women who aren't likable, they're not good mothers, they're not good daughters, they're just people, navigating complicated cultural, political, economic dynamics, and very frayed relationships with each other. I definitely see why I ended up on the women's prize list. It's really good. I would recommend it. Um, Especially as well as a kind of like narrative way to kind of learn a little bit more about Iranian history as well. Next, I conquered something, and finally finished The Count of Monte Cristo. My partner and I had been buddy reading this together. I think we started in like 2024, um, but then we both got like really busy and we decided to put it down for a while because like we couldn't read at the same rates and we weren't able to talk about it and stuff. Um, but we picked it up again and ended up kind of racing through it. Well, my partner raced through the end of it. It took me a little bit longer. I'm so surprised by how easily readable this book is. It it's a chunky book. Mine is like 1,400 and I think 88 pages. It's a big book. Um, but it is really, really compelling. I did struggle a little bit picking it back up again because it had been quite a while since I first put it down, and there's a lot of story in here. Like it's dense, but not in a way where it's like I cannot follow this. I can't remember what's going on. There's just a lot of information. There's a lot of narrative in here. Um, but once I kind of picked it back up and I'd sort of skimmed back over it, I fell like straight back into this story. So this is, if you don't know, it's about a young man from Marseille called Edmond Dantes. He is a sailor. At the start of the novel, he's on like a voyage. The captain dies and makes him the captain instead of like the next most senior man. And the captain also entrusts to Dantes a letter that is to be given to a Bonapartist in Paris. So this is kind of, it initially takes place while Napoleon is exiled on Elba. So there's a lot of kind of contemporary, like contemporary to this time, not contemporary now, royalist, Bonapartist politics kind of going on in the background of this book that are really actually way more important to the development of the narrative than I thought they would be. But anyway, when he comes back to Marseille, um, he becomes the center of a plot by the man who is overlooked on the boat for the captaincy, Danglars, and a man named Fernand. And Fernand is the cousin of this woman, Mercedes, that Dantes is in love with. So Mercedes and Dantes are going to get married. They have an engagement party. But at this engagement party, Dantes is arrested. And it turns out that Danglars and Fernand have put together a letter that basically implies that Dantes is a traitor because he has maybe met with Napoleon. He's carrying this letter that is to be taken to a Bonapartist that has information that would be dangerous to the king. This letter gets into the hands of a prosecutor called Villefort. When Dantes is arrested, he goes to see Villefort. Villefort kind of realizes what's happened, that he's kind of been set up. He's about to let him go, but then he reads the letter and he finds out where the letter was supposed to go. And the letter was supposed to go to Villefort's father, who is a known Bonapartist. But Villefort is trying to keep that under wraps. And so it becomes beneficial to kind of all of these men, Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort, that Dantes disappears. So he is imprisoned in the Chateau d'If for 15 years. He loses 15 years of his life to this sort of false accusation, this false imprisonment. But while he's in prison, he meets a priest who just so happens to have a treasure map that leads to a huge fortune on the island of Monte Cristo. Dantes escapes the prison with the help of the priest, gets all this fortune, finds all this money, vows vengeance on these three men. And that's kind of like the first 300 pages of this book, which in a normal book is like a lot, but in this, not so much. The rest is Dantes's revenge playing out, and it is a very carefully, intricately plotted revenge. It is kind of pieces falling into place. It is secrets being revealed. It's a very satisfying story in the way that things come together. And we're not always privy as the reader to everything that Dantes knows. And so sometimes we're kind of almost as surprised as the characters are in the way that things fall into place. So it's very, very satisfying. I think Dumas keeps you in a very fun place as the reader, where you are a couple of steps ahead of Danglars and Fernand and Villefort, but you're a couple of steps behind the Count of Monte Cristo. And I think that's really, really fun. The other thing that I really liked about this book that I don't think I anticipated would be part of it is the way that Dumas is critiquing French nobility. He's constantly kind of making fun of the French nobility. There's a whole thing about how nobody in the French nobility knows how to appreciate art. They're all kind of putting on airs all the time. Very kind of sharp critique of aristocracy. So I enjoyed that a lot. It's intimidating, but if you have the patience, I would really, really recommend it. It is really, really fun, and a lot more readable than you might think it is. Next is another book that I started forever ago and finally finished this month, and it is Buried Deep and Other Stories by Naomi Novik. I borrowed this from my aunt, who picked it up after I recommended her Temeraire, the Novik's series about dragons in the Napoleonic Wars. I haven't read all that series. Full disclosure, I've only read the first one and loved it. I keep meaning to go back, haven't. Very classic behavior. So this is actually only the second Novik book that I've read, but I really, really liked this. I don't think all the stories hit. I'm not exactly sure how many there are. This is kind of boring. I'm not counting them, but there's a handful. There's a decent amount in here. Not every one of them hits because it's a short story collection, and that's just not going to be the case. Um, but for the most part, I thought the hit to miss ratio was really good in this. Um, some of them are brand new stories, completely independent of anything else. And then some of them are linked to her existing worlds, to, for instance, Temeraire or Scholomance, um, which I also haven't read, but after reading the Scholomance story in this, I'm desperate to. Because I've read Temeraire, I particularly enjoyed the stories that were set in this world. There's one where it's kind of like a Pride and Prejudice retelling where Elizabeth Bennet is the main character and she's a dragon rider. And she meets Mr. Darcy and he's very intimidated by her because she's a dragon rider. But I thought that was very cool and very fun, a very like interesting spin. But yeah, it's a really cool collection. Lots of different kinds of stories, lots of different kinds of fantasy worlds. There's a kind of classic sort of fairy tale, folkloric kind of story about a young woman collecting like pieces of silver and stuff. Um, there's a kind of pirate fantasy kind of story at the end that I thought was very fun. Um, yeah, I kind of took my time with this one, um, but I think it's really good. I think Novik is a really, really solid voice in fantasy at the moment, in contemporary fantasy. Not a controversial thing to say, obviously. I think if people know that, I'm the one who's kind of behind the eight ball on that. But I really enjoyed this. Um, and I would definitely, I mean, I've got to read the next Temeraire book anyway, but I would definitely seek out more of her work, having read this series of stories. Short stories not usually my thing, but I vibed with this. Um, and I also last year read Out There Screaming by the collection edited by Jordan Peele. Loved that too. So maybe I need to reevaluate my position on short story collections. Maybe I need to be a bit more open minded. The last two things are a poetry collection and a manga. So the poetry collection is The Nightmare Sequence by Omar Sakir with accompanying illustrations by Saftar Ahmed. Um, the poems in this are about the ongoing genocide of Palestinians. It's a hard read, but it's incredibly poignant and relevant and important. They particularly from the perspective of Sakir as an Arab Muslim man living in Australia, kind of watching the genocide unfold, of like doing everything you can, but not being able to make that much of a difference because the people that are actually in power and that have the power to stop it aren't shaken by the deaths of tens of thousands of brown people. They don't care. Sakia does like this incredible job of capturing the rage and the grief, um, and the kind of absurdity of doing anything else at the moment when there's a genocide happening. The idea of like going to work and in his perspective of even just writing poems when people are dying, it feels absurd. It feels stupid. It feels like it just feels like nonsense. Like that the world is falling down around our ears, and we're all supposed to just still be good little soldiers of capitalism while that's happening. And I think he captures that feeling really well. Um, and the feeling of kind of like nothing else should matter, but it feels like everyone is trying to look away. But I think he also does a really good job of also capturing all of the kind of complicated, nuanced emotions of feeling this incredible guilt and pain and wanting to kind of like stop and look away, then feeling so selfish about looking away because Palestinians can't escape it. There's no putting your phone down and walking away. It's life for them. And shouldn't we all feel uncomfortable in our discomfort about this? Um, It's a beautiful collection. There are lines in poems that just knocked the wind right out of me. Would really highly recommend. I think it really captures what it feels like at the moment to live like this. Finally, the manga that I read this month was The Summer Hikaru Died, volume 5. I've really been enjoying this series. I think it's kind of like it's so spooky and cool and interesting and compelling. Obviously, like the relationship dynamics are like super interesting and meaty, and I'm loving it. This volume in particular, I really enjoyed the kind of lore drops, for lack of a better term. I liked that we're like finding out more about like what's going on in the village, who or what Hikaru is, and the kind of way that his relationships are developing with not just Yoshiki, but with everybody else kind of around him. I'm really liking this series. I think it's really cool, and yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes. So that's kind of all that I read this month. Not a bad reading month for me. Um, I oscillate a lot. Um, Sometimes I get into big slumps, but I had a pretty good time this month. And I finished off a lot of stuff, which always makes me feel a bit more energized about my reading. Um, the plans for this month, I picked up at the library A Little Trickery by Rosanna Pike, which is also on the Women's Prize long list for last year. I've also got Big Swiss out from the library at the moment. And then it'll just be kind of more Women's Prize books. I want to get a couple more romances in next month. I'm currently reading Game Changers. I've been reading that forever. For some reason, I just can't get through it. And I don't think it's the actual book. I don't think it's got anything to do with the book, really. I think it's just me. Um, yeah. So we'll see how it goes. We'll check back in. I'll see you in a month. Take care of yourselves.